Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. So, Pope Leo has released his first magisterial document in his pontificate so far. This is his Apostolic Exhortation de Lexi Te, Latin for I have loved you, a reference to the book of Revelation. And so we're going to talk about this. I'm going to focus on this topic in this stream. I had originally planned today on covering a couple other news items. People are discussing the Vatican is giving Muslims official prayer spaces in the Vatican. And we're also seeing the USCCB, the Catholic bishops in the United States, have approved a Bible translation that takes out homosexuality as a sin from the Bible. I wanted to discuss reports about those things, but I think instead of addressing them today, I'm just going to table those reports and we'll take a look at those situations another time, and I'll maybe offer some direction on them in a later stream. Today, I just want to focus on this document from Pope Leo, especially because this is his first magisterial document of his pontificate. And interestingly enough, this document was initiated by Pope Francis in his pontificate. And now Leo is continuing it and finished it and put his own mark on it as well. And, you know, it's interesting with Pope Francis, his first document was partly initiated and written by Pope Benedict XVI. And then he completed it and made it his own. So we noticed the first document of Pope Francis kind of had that continuity with his predecessor because of that. And so this document likewise has that continuity with his predecessor, Pope Francis, because he initiated it. So what I wanted to do is maybe give you an overview of the document, as well as some interesting statistics on its citations and references, followed by a few highlights from the document that we'll take a look at together. And then after that, I want us to maybe take a look at a few reactions that we're seeing on social media so far about the document. It's about 20,000 words, so it would take a few hours to read, so it's a little lengthy. Popes for quite some time now have been, creating these very giant tomes and their encyclicals and apostolic exhortations. And it's certainly not the kind of format that you would expect in a soundbite, Twitter age, but nonetheless, they're sustaining that position of writing these very lengthy documents. And so it may take a little while for you to read through the whole thing, but I encourage you to do that. It's available in multiple translations already on the Vatican website, and I'll put a link to where you can go to read it, especially in English, on the Vatican website, for you to maybe get a more comprehensive overview of the document in your own reading. Okay, before we dive in, let me remind you, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. I would greatly appreciate your support for this channel, especially if you appreciate the content that I've been providing. Okay, so let's maybe talk about, let's actually go with a breakdown of the references first, before I even just give you an overview. He has about 130 references footnoted and cited at the bottom of this document. Well, what do these footnotes kind of tell us about it? Are they mostly stuff from recent popes? Is it mostly from the Middle Ages? Is it from the Church Fathers? Are there a lot of biblical references? Is it a lot of Vatican II? Those are questions that I think people are going to be interested in. And so here's a breakdown of what I was able to retrieve as far as statistics on the 130 references in the footnotes. So in this document that is about the poor and the church's mission and care of the poor in society, and the poor here is people who are obviously poor financially, people who are marginalized in society. Also, there's a big emphasis on immigrants as well. So what is he really drawing from to talk about this in the document? Well, from what I can tell, about 26% of the document is going to be biblical references. So either a quote of scripture or some kind of allusion to scripture. About 26% of it, so a little bit over a quarter, is going to be based on the Bible. As far as patristic references, the church fathers, the fathers of the church in the early church period, so Ambrose, Augustine, Chrysostom, Cyprian, and others, Benedict, Basil, um, Gregory the Great, and Gregory Nazianzus, among others. How much do they account for the document? Well, about 15%, 15%. So there's a decent amount of patristic references in here, in addition to a quarter being references to the Bible. Now, what about popes? You know, how much of the document is citing other popes? Well, it's actually pretty heavy in citing other popes. 61% of these 130 references are papal references. As far as councils, you know, what about the ecumenical councils? How many of those are referenced here? About 6%, so not a whole lot. Now, what about references that we find after Vatican II? You know, the most recent ecumenical council, 1962 to 1965. We tend to see in a lot of these magisterial documents a lot of references that mostly come from the time period after the Second Vatican Council, so after the 60s. So we have that time period of after Vatican II and the time period before Vatican II, before the 1960s, you know, so from the time of Jesus all the way up to Vatican II. So what about time periods? So references to documents that are after Vatican II, 76%. So most of the document is relying on documents, magisterial documents that are in the post-conciliar period, that are after the Second Vatican Council. About 5% are references to Vatican II itself. Again, the most recent ecumenical council, 1962 to 1965. And about 19% are going to be references before Vatican II. So in that time period between Jesus and Vatican II in 1962, you have about 19%. And that's not including like biblical references. That's a separate statistic. So it's heavily drawing from more recent documents of the church, but some here and there from the pre-conciliar period. Now, what about references to Pope Francis? How many references are there to Pope Francis? 46% of the references from this document is Pope Francis. So his fingerprints are all over it. So almost half of it is quoting and referencing Pope Francis's magisterium and magisterial documents. And, you know, he told us he was going to very much be in line with his predecessor, Pope Francis. He was very much going to be in line with the post-conciliar period. He told us this up front, and we can see that reflected in the references to the document. So he is certainly keeping his word on that. Now, before we actually read some of the document together, let's just maybe just briefly cover an overview of the document. So again, this is an apostolic exhortation. Well, when it comes to the magisterium of the church, there are different document types. And the document type can sometimes tell you a little bit about how authoritative the teaching is. Now, I'm going to give you just a quick overview, but I've covered this in a great deal of more detail in my magisterium lectures, the courses that I offer on the magisterium. I've now made available to everybody. In fact, if you go to rtcourses.com, RT as in Reason and Theology, rtcourses.com, You can see those lectures that I've made available where you can study the magisterium in a lot more detail than what we're going to cover today. Tells you everything you need to know about it, an introduction to the magisterium, what the magisterium is, the foundation for the magisterium in the Bible, the history of the magisterium, and then how to read magisterial documents like apostolic exhortations, like what we have here. Look, that's not something I can cover comprehensively in this video. So I do want to point y'all to those lectures. They are already available at the bundled price for a discount, but if you purchase the lecture that I'm going to be delivering in 2 weeks, October 25th, Understanding Papal Infallibility, what it is, its history, and challenges and difficulties to papal infallibility. That lecture that I'm going to be delivering, if you purchase it right now at the early bird discount, you'll get 30% off the already discounted price on the Magisterium Studies program. So take advantage of that opportunity now while you still have it. After you've purchased the Understanding Papal Infallibility course, then it will give you, at that moment of checkout, after checkout actually, that 30% off the Magisterium bundle. Take advantage of it if you want to learn more about the Magisterium. Now, apostolic exhortations. Again, the document type can sometimes tell you something about how authoritative the Pope intends something to be. For example, if this were an apostolic constitution, that's probably the highest form of a papal document. So if he were to have released this as an apostolic constitution, that would tell you he's putting the full force of the authority of Rome behind this. And in a lot of cases, you have, papal infallibility being exercised in apostolic constitutions. So, I think we expected this wouldn't be an apostolic constitution, right? He's not putting the full weight of his papal authority behind this, but it's also, it's not a document that's insignificant in its magisterial weight either. An apostolic exhortation is fairly weighty. I mean, it's much weightier than a papal homily or a general audience or something. Theologians have debated how authoritative is a papal encyclical versus an apostolic exhortation. There's no official answer from Rome on like the status of some of these things in relation to each other. But an apostolic exhortation is certainly somewhere in between an apostolic constitution and a general audience, right? It's somewhere in the middle, right? So it's not the full weight of Rome, but it's also not an insignificant amount of authority that he's putting behind this. It's important. And so the magisterium teaches, of course, whenever documents like this are released, that there's an expectation that Catholics offer religious submission of intellect and will to the teachings. So even if the teachings are not infallible in nature, there's a expectation, according to the profession of faith, that all Catholics must hold to, that one intellectually submits to the teachings in the document. There's that obligation and there's that duty, even if the teachings themselves are proposed in perhaps a reformable way, even if they're not taught definitively or infallibly. And that's what's going on here, right? So the teachings that you find in here, is this papal infallibility? Is this infallible? Is this ex cathedra? No, it's not that, right? It's not the full force of the papal magisterium, but it's also not just private opinion, and a personal opinion of a pope acting as a theologian. It is authoritative. It is magisterial. Okay, so it's called, again, Delexi Te, I have loved you, a reference from the book of Revelation, where Jesus addresses this to a poor and powerless church, which goes with the theme of the document, which is about, again, the poor, and even focusing even at one point on immigrants. And we're going to take a look at that here in a moment. What is the central message? Love for Christ and love for the poor are inseparable. So if you love Jesus, you're going to love the poor. And it's essential to the church's mission to serve the poor and focus on the poor and have a preferential option to use the Vatican's language. Some have associated that with liberation theology and the liberation theology movement, that kind of language. The Vatican has kind of adopted that type of language, especially under Pope Francis. and now also Leo. So there's this preferential option for the poor. There's a preference to the poor. And again, along with this central message is indifference to the poor means turning away from God himself and rejecting Christ in a sense. There's this part where we're going to see here in a moment. He talks about how any rejected immigrant is rejecting Jesus. So if you reject an immigrant, you're rejecting Jesus, because Jesus is in that immigrant. Jesus is in the poor type of ideology. That's certainly going to be very controversial here in the United States, right? With some of the immigration debates that are going on. So he's weighing in very heavily on some matters of American politics, as we're going to see. And in fact, I probably need to pull it up. We did see him say just a couple of days ago that for the time being, he's not going to weigh in on matters of American politics. That 2 days later is over. He's very much intervening in matters of American politics, which popes have the prerogative of doing, right? As I've pointed out, popes have always been political. Popes have always intervened in politics of all countries. Popes have always had that ministry, right? Because in reality, faith, morals, and politics are they go hand in hand. They're inseparable. So popes have always, commented on such things. Okay. So, what are some of the things it condemns? It condemns modern indifferentism and systems that perpetuate inequality and consumerism. Again, that's kind of going to be a shot at some of the Western, even American systems. And so there's certainly a criticism here of the United States at some parts, among others. It focuses on caring for the sick, educating the poor, liberating the oppressed, and accompanying migrants. And then it has a overall challenge that, again, the credibility of the church's mission depends on whether or not it reflects Christ's love for the poor. That's the main focus of this document. Let's go ahead and take a look at a few highlights together here. I have it right here in front of me. Well noted, but a lot of notations here, a lot of comments, but I'll limit myself to some highlights and just read a few paragraphs that I'm seeing jump out at me, and also that others are discussing online, and you'll likely see people discussing moving forward as they read through this document. Okay. So the first part that really jumped out at me was paragraph 3. He says, for this reason, in continuity with the encyclical Delexit Nos, Pope Francis was preparing in the last months of his life as an apostolic exhortation of the church's care for the poor, to which he gave the title Delexite, as if Christ speaks those words to each of them, saying, you have but little power, yet I have loved you. Again, a reference to Revelation 3:9. He says, I'm happy to make this document my own. Okay, so here he's noting very clearly this document was initiated by Pope Francis, but it wasn't completed by him. I believe it was initiated in April of this year. And of course, he passed away shortly afterwards. And so it was initiated by him, and then completed by Pope Leo. And you can see Pope Francis's footprints all over it, fingerprints all over it. But you can also see Leo's voice in it as well. And often they go hand in hand, right? They very much have the same perspective on these things. He says, I'm happy to make this document my own. So you can't say, oh, no, that was a Pope Francis thing. No. He says, I'm making that my own. These are my words. This is my voice. A lot of times popes have used ghostwriters and others, and I'm sure Leo, to a degree, had some of his own, ghostwriters and contributions from others in this document. But what happens ultimately is the Pope kind of adopts those things as his own. He might pick and choose some things, delete things, and add some of his own contributions. But a lot of times, documents are often written by others, and then popes just kind of clean things up a little bit, add some stuff here and there, and then they make it their own. Uh, Now, some others have just kind of written out the whole thing. That has happened before. But it is pretty common for them to have ghostwriters. And so you can kind of think of Pope Francis as partly Pope Francis and his ghostwriters as partly the ghostwriters for Leo, right? For Leo and his ghostwriters. So he says, I'm happy to make this document my own, adding some reflections and to issue it at the beginning of my own pontificate, since I share the desire of my beloved predecessor, talking about Pope Francis, that all Christians come to appreciate the close connection between Christ's love and his summons to care for the poor. I too consider it essential to insist on this path to holiness for. In this call to recognize him in the poor and the suffering, we see revealed the very heart of Christ, his deepest feelings and choices, which every saint seeks to imitate. So that gives you right there the substance of the document, paragraph 3, right there. That summarizes the whole thing for you. But let's look at a little bit more, right? Let's not just stop there. Paragraph 11 says this: a concrete commitment to the poor must also be accompanied by a change in mentality that can have an impact at the cultural level. In fact, the illusion of happiness derives from a comfortable life, pushes many people towards a vision of life centered on the accumulation of wealth and social success at all cost, even at the expense of others, and by taking advantage of unjust social ideals and political economic systems that favor the strongest. So any kind of political system that favors the strong, he's critiquing that. Thus, in a world where the poor are increasingly numerous, we paradoxically see the growth of a wealthy elite living in a bubble of comfort and luxury, almost in another world compared to ordinary people. In light of recent comments of his critiquing Elon Musk with comments along those lines, Pope Leo may have figures like Elon Musk in mind here, because again, recently, I think it was a week or so, maybe 2 weeks ago, he said something very similar in criticism of Elon Musk. This means that a culture still persists, sometimes well disguised, that discards others without even realizing it and tolerates with indifference that millions of people die of hunger or survive in conditions unfit for human beings. A few years ago, the photo of a lifeless child lying on a Mediterranean beach caused an uproar. Unfortunately, apart from some momentary outcry, similar events are becoming increasingly irrelevant and seem as marginal news items. Well, yeah, we've seen that problem a lot of times, right? A selective outrage, and also maybe outrage over something that lasts like a day, and then people just kind of forget all about it. That's unfortunately the nature of things that we've been seeing for quite some time. Paragraph 14, he says, the poor are not there by chance or blind and cruel fate. Listen to that. Nor for the most of them is poverty a choice. So that's a shot at those who want to say, those poor people out there, it's because they're not getting up, getting out there with that go get 'em attitude and being all that they could be and striving for success. He's saying, no, poverty is not usually a choice, he argues. Yet there are those who still presume to make this claim, thus revealing their own blindness and cruelty. It's not mincing words, right? Of course, among the poor, there are those who do not want to work, perhaps because of their ancestors who worked all their lives and died poor. However, there are so many others, men and women, who nonetheless work from dawn to dusk, perhaps collecting scraps or the like, even though they know that their hard work will only help them scrape by, but never really improve their lives. Nor can it be said that most of the poor are such because they do not deserve otherwise, as maintained by that specious view of meritocracy that sees only the successful as, quote, deserving. In the next paragraph, paragraph 15, he says, Christians too, on a number of occasions, have succumbed to attitudes shaped by secular ideologies or political and economic approaches that lead to gross generalizations and mistaken conclusions. He continues, the fact that some dismiss or ridicule charitable works as if there were an obsession on the part of a few and not the burning heart of the church's mission convinces me of the need to go back and reread the gospel, he says, lest we risk replacing it with the wisdom of the world. The poor cannot be neglected if we are to remain with the great current of the church's life that has its source in the gospel and bears fruit in every time and space. So he's saying, some dismiss or ridicule charitable works as if they're an obsession on the part of a few. People who are just emphasizing taking care of the poor and stuff like that. He's saying some people dismiss those people who want to focus on the poor and works of charity. He says, but the people who are dismissing it, they need to go back and reread the gospel. Because he says the gospel, the center of the gospel, is taking care of the poor for him. In the next paragraph, he speaks of a preferential option on the part of God to the poor. Again, that's the language that you've often seen with Latin American liberation theology. In fact, he's very candid that this comes from the Latin American continent, and he does cite from liberation theology themed documents of the Vatican in parts of this. And so this is something that, again, we've seen in the past several pontificates now. Kind of, we initially saw when liberation theology came out some criticism from John Paul II on liberation theology. And the Vatican kind of took a critical approach to it. But since then, we've seen kind of an opening up towards liberation theology on part of the Vatican, and maybe kind of a qualified adopting of liberation theology. And so that language of a preferential option on part of God for the poor is probably going to alert people to that theme. And so you'll probably hear people discussing liberation theology. Is the Pope a communist? Is the Pope a Marxist? Because he's using this kind of terminology. That discussion and debate that we heard with Pope Francis, is he a Marxist? Is he a communist? We're going to see that discussion continue in this pontificate in light of this kind of language, especially this early on in the pontificate of Pope Leo. So I think there's going to be some controversy surrounding, is he a communist? Is he a Marxist? And some people are going to say, no, that's a poor reading of him. That's unfair. Others are going to say, no, he's just a commie pope. And there's going to be, that debate's going to continue into this pontificate, for better or worse. It's not something that was going to be unique just to Pope Francis. Now, he has an interesting part here that is certainly a criticism of the United States and most likely Trump in MAGA Catholicism and just MAGA Christianity in general. There are some elements here that are, it's clear that's what he's critiquing, right? Maybe this is one such case. Here in paragraph 75, he says, the church, like a mother, accompanies those who are walking where the world sees threats and sees children, where walls are built. Okay, that's obviously a reference to Trump, right? With the wall, with the border. Yeah, that's clearly a reference to Trump. Where walls are built, the church instead builds bridges. Well, Pope Francis said the exact same thing in criticizing Trump, right? Don't build walls, build bridges. And a lot of people made fun of Pope Francis. Well, you got walls all around the Vatican. That whole thing is going to continue into this pontificate because, Pope Leo is reasserting that statement. The world sees threats, but the church there sees children. So he's talking about immigrants, right? Immigrants maybe coming into the United States and other places. There's some people in the United States, they see that as a threat to society and therefore want to build the wall, right? He's saying, no, don't see them as a threat. See them as children of God and build bridges with them and accept them. She, that is the church, knows that her proclamation of the gospel is credible only when it is translated into gestures of closeness and welcome. So, in other words, if you're not welcoming the immigrant, you're not living the gospel, he argues. And she knows that in every rejected migrant, it is Christ himself who knocks at the door of the community. So he's arguing if you're rejecting a migrant, you're rejecting Jesus, because it's Jesus living in that migrant. And therefore, you're denying the gospel, you're denying Jesus if you're closing your door and you're closing your borders to migrants. That's going to be something incredibly controversial here, especially in the United States, where many Catholics and even non-Catholic Christians, right, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, are very much pro borders, have some concerns about immigration policies of the last administration, want to see more of a crackdown on these problems and difficulties and issues and controversies. And here he's saying, well, if you're rejecting a migrant, you're rejecting Jesus. Again, a lot of people are just going to outright say, how dare he even say that? And they're going to reject it and they're going to slam him for it. Others are going to say, yes, thank you so much for saying that. That's the gospel, right? So that's going to be a huge source of controversy. That paragraph right there, paragraph 75, that's, in my opinion, going to be ground zero for this document. In continuing to take a look at it, however, let's maybe take a look at paragraph 92. He speaks of a dictatorship of an economy that kills. So he's critiquing certain economic systems. He says, we must continue then to denounce the dictatorship of an economy that kills, and to recognize that while the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is the result of ideologies that defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. A new tyranny is being born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. He continues. There is no shortage of theories attempting to justify the present state of affairs or to explain that economic thinking requires us to wait for invisible market forces to resolve everything. Nevertheless, the dignity of every human being must be respected today, not tomorrow. And that extreme poverty of all those whom this dignity is denied should be constantly weighed upon our consciences. So any kind of economy that is oppressing the poor, he has no shortage of criticisms for. Paragraph 92. Moving forward a little bit to paragraph 96, he speaks of the throwaway culture, something that we saw a lot from Pope Francis, criticizing the throwaway culture. You buy a computer, it's no good. Instead of repairing the computer, you toss it out and buy another one. You buy a vacuum. It's not worth getting it repaired. Just toss it out, buy another one. You buy a pair of shoes, they get dirty, toss them out, buy another one, right? They used to have services where you could get your vacuum cleaner repaired or your shoes repaired. I remember my grandma telling me about those things. She was, World War II era. And she spoke about those, shoe stores. They wouldn't just toss out a bad pair of shoes. You had to go and get them fixed at a store because you wouldn't waste anything. And so you would go and repair the soles or whatever. And it's very different than today, right? And so there's that criticism of the throwaway culture. For the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. So we see that ecological emphasis on the environment here that we've seen already in his pontificate, that Pope Francis spoke a lot about. He's been very, very clear. He's going to continue the ecological perspective of Pope Francis and kind of hammering out, that question. We're seeing a little bit of it here in this document. Paragraph 97, all the members of the people of God have a duty to make their voices heard, albeit in different ways, in order to point out and denounce such structural issues, even at the cost of appearing foolish or naive. Unjust structures need to be recognized and eradicated by the force of good. So he's saying unjust structures in society that are unjust towards the poor, he says they need to be eradicated. Right after that, paragraph 98, finally, in a document that was not initially well received by everyone, this was a CDF document, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, now known as the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith. It's kind of that doctrinal arm of the Vatican, formerly the Holy Inquisition. So that Dicastery released a document on liberation theology, and he says that document was not well received by everyone at the time. He says in that document, we find a reflection that remains timely today. The defenders of orthodoxy are sometimes accused of passivity, indulgence, or culpable complicity regarding the intolerable situations of unjust and the political regimes which prolong them. Spiritual conversion, the intensity of the love of God and neighbor, zeal for justice and peace, the gospel meaning of the poor and of poverty are required of everyone, especially of pastors and those in positions of responsibility. Then he says, the concern for the purity of the faith demands giving the answer of effective witness in the service of one's neighbor, the poor and the oppressed in particular, in an integral theological fashion. What does he say? Okay. Well, you have people who are very, very concerned with doctrinal purity, doctrinal orthodoxy, weeding out heresy in the church, making sure the teachings are properly formulated and expressed and understood, doctrinal purity. He says people who are focused on doctrinal purity are often characterized as not caring about the poor. But he says people who are concerned about doctrinal orthodoxy and the purity of the faith should really show that in their concern for the poor. Moving forward a little bit more. Paragraph 112. By her very nature, the church is in solidarity with the poor, the excluded, the marginalized, and all those considered the outcasts of society. So he says the poor, these are outcasts of society, and the church is focused on those people who are outcasts. And he mentions the poor and others. I do wonder that language and others here. I understand what he's saying here. I bet, however, people who are a more liberal bent, people who want to perhaps promote transgenderism, homosexuality in the Catholic Church, they're probably going to latch on to that because that's the language that they often appeal to. Outcasts of society, those who are marginalized, and the church should care about those who are marginalized. And all that is true, by the way. The church should care about everybody, including those who are marginalized. But those tend to be phrases and those tend to be themes that some on the liberal end kind of hijack and use for other purposes with ulterior motives. And I suspect they're probably going to attempt to do that with this paragraph here. The next paragraph, at times Christian movements or groups have arisen which show little or no interest in the common good of society, and in particular the protection and advancement of its most vulnerable and disadvantaged members. He says, yet we must never forget that religion, especially the Christian religion, cannot be limited to the private sphere, as if believers had no business making their voice heard with regard to problems affecting civil society and issues of concern to its members. And that somewhat touches a little bit more on what I said initially. Popes constantly intervening in matters of politics. It's always been the history of popes to do that. Here he's asserting the right of the church, and that would also include the Pope, to intervene in those matters and to not just say the church is only focused on matters of faith and morals and matters of society and politics is outside of the scope of the church. He's rejecting that outright and saying, no, 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 they all go hand in hand. I think that gives you a pretty good idea of some of the highlights of the document. Let's maybe take a look at some reactions and also other additional information that we're finding out online, as well as a few articles that are going on that help maybe give some insight here a little bit into the document. I'm going to share my screen so we can follow along together. Please hit the like button and hit the subscribe to button too as well, if you don't mind, especially if you have benefited from the content of Reason and Theology and you appreciate the content here. You want to see more like it, hit that sub button, hit the like button. All right, let me share my screen and let's take a look at this. So presenting this document, it was presented at the Vatican. One cardinal rejects questions about which section of the text is Francis's and which is Leo's, right? So some people ask, like, what part was Francis's? What part was Leo's? Well, maybe there's somewhat of a, I understand the question, right? But there is somewhat of a misunderstanding because, again, when a pope puts his stamp of approval on it, even if he didn't write it, it's now his own words, So the popes often have ghostwriters, but then it becomes his words when he puts that rubber stamp on it, right? So which part came from Francis, which came from him doesn't really matter ultimately, because the whole thing's approved by Leo and therefore the whole thing is his own. But I understand the question, right? I understand what they're doing here. He says, and this says, he responds, this is the Pope Leo's document. This is the magisterium of the church. So he's very clear this is a magisterial document, which we already knew, right? I mean, very magisterium 101. It's an apostolic exhortation. And so already, you know, that's a magisterial document. And if there were any reservations or questions, it's very clear at the very end of the document, quote, given in Rome at St. Peter's on the 4th of October, the memorial of St. Francis of Assisi, in the year 2025, the first of my pontificate, Leo Pope the 14th, Pope Leo the 14th. So very clearly he's signing this as Pope, right? And so this is 100% ordinary papal magisterium. And therefore, again, requires that religious submission of intellect and will to the teachings in here. Prudential judgments and stuff like that, you know, those tend to require obedience and a certain degree of adherence, with rare exceptions, according to Donum Veritatis, which we've explored here on this channel many times, and also in my magisterium lectures. So if you want to, again, check those out, rtcourses.com, there's a lot more there. Okay, so let's see here. Let's go to this. Now, Pope Leo simultaneously today actually met with a number of bishops from the United States. He's very much stressing a message of immigration and being open to immigrants. We saw that not only in the document, but that's something he's reiterating with American bishops, telling them, speak out on the question in the United States on immigration. So again, just a couple days ago, he said, hey, at the moment, I'm not going to comment on American politics. Well, that lasted only 2 days. Now he's right back to commenting on American politics, which, again, the Pope can do. And I didn't think it was going to be long term that he was going to hold judgment on American politics. I figured he would jump back in pretty quickly. And I didn't know it'd be 2 days later, but here he is. Our Holy Father, according to one of the bishops who met with him, our Holy Father is very personally concerned about these matters of immigration. He expressed his desire that the U.S. Bishops' Conference would speak strongly on the immigration issue. It means a lot to us to know of his personal desire that we continue to speak out. Well, so he's urging the United States bishops to speak out. Now, I do have to say, as I'm going to cover, I told y'all, again, 2 news items we're not going to be able to explore in detail today, but the Vatican has come out providing prayer spaces in the Vatican for Muslims to pray in the Vatican. That was story number 1. And story number 2 is the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, approved a Bible translation that removes homosexuality as a sin from the Bible. So homosexuality is no longer a sin in the Bible in this translation, and it's approved by the U.S. bishops. From reports that we're seeing out there, I was going to review some of this stuff and take a look at it, see how accurate any of this is. And, you know, I would hope, in conjunction with the discussion to the U.S. bishops about immigration issues, that there would be a conversation about maybe not removing homosexuality from the Bible. Just my thoughts. Okay. CNN. So if you wanted to see how a secular liberal media outlet is processing this, CNN says this: Leo speaks out on a dictatorship of any economic inequality and support for migrants, the headline says, in his first major text. So it's focusing on the question of immigration there. And it is connecting it to some of the things that we see with the current administration with Trump. The Daily Beast is saying Pope Leo has reportedly escalated his growing feud, they say, with President Trump, instructing U.S. bishops to take a stronger public stand against the president's hardline immigration policies. So there's going to probably be some more tension here between the Pope and Trump, and maybe even the Pope and J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is a professed Catholic, right? And so he says he's a Catholic, and it's going to be interesting to see how he processes this and these criticisms of, the administration that he's a part of. We'll see. Now, a more liberal and very controversial priest, Father James Martin, how's he reacting to this? What are the liberal priests in the church saying? So if you want to kind of get a feel for where they're coming from and the perception that they have of it, I tend to like to show y'all, here's what, the liberals are saying, here's what the traditionalists are saying. I haven't seen a whole lot of responses yet from the traditionalist position, so I can't report on that yet, but I have seen immediate reports from your more liberal voices like Father James Martin. He says, Leo, in a new letter to the Catholic Charities United States, USA, migrants are living witnesses of hope with an intrinsic human dignity, who should be invited to participate fully in community life. So there's a couple controversies here. I mean, Catholic Charities USA was very, very instrumental on the question of immigration and bringing in a lot of the immigrants into the United States. And so people were very supportive of the administration, previous administration's policies on immigration. Probably going to love Catholic Charities USA. Others who are more critical probably going to have some concerns. Here, Leo is very clearly signaling his approval for Catholic Charities USA, which again is very much commenting on American politics. So when he said 2 days ago, I'm going to refrain from speaking on American politics at this time, he meant literally for those a day or two. He's very clearly commenting on this now. Okay, now let's see actually from the horse's mouth, Father James Martin, again, very liberal and controversial priest, LGBTQ priest. How's he perceiving this document from Pope Leo? Does he love it? Does he hate it? What are his thoughts? Let's see what he has to say. Somebody said there's no sound. Okay, thank you for alerting me to that. Let me start it over one more time, and let's try it again.
Pope Leo XIV says that he often wonders why, if sacred scripture is so clear on the need to care for the poor, that so many people feel that they can safely ignore the poor. That's part of Pope Leo's beautiful new apostolic exhortation, De Lexi Te, on love for the poor, which was just published today. It was begun under Pope Francis and completed by Pope Leo. It begins, of course, with Jesus Christ, his own being born into poverty, and his own choosing of poverty during his public ministry, and most especially his own care for the poor, and his command to us to care for the poor. Care for the poor continues through the early church, and Pope Leo traces this also through the lives of the saints, so many saints who have made their life's work to be caring for the poor. It's part of the tradition of the church and has always been And he highlights especially the rich tradition of Catholic social teaching that began in earnest in contemporary times with Pope Leo's predecessor, Leo XIII. But popes like John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul II, Benedict the 16th, and of course Pope Francis have consistently spoken of the need for the church to be in solidarity with the poor and for Catholics to be in solidarity with the poor. Along the way, Pope Leo talks about structural poverty and structures of sin that keep people poor, and has a wonderful section on the preferential option for the poor. So this is not about being woke in any way. This is about following Jesus in the Gospels and following church teachings. So please read De Lexi Te. It's a beautiful meditation. Take it to prayer and listen to what Pope Leo has to say.
I thought that was interesting. He said it's not woke. It's not woke. It's the message of the New Testament. That's interesting that he's kind of having to guard against that accusation, because I guess he's already either seeing that accusation or is anticipating it. Because some of these themes and some of this language, some of these positions are often associated with being woke. So again, he's either seen people already invoke that as a criticism, or he's expecting it in light of some of the content. So that was kind of insightful that that's where he decided to take the conversation. Here, Pope Leo sent a handwritten note to the bishops accompanying the apostolic exhortation. And here's what it says, if I can read the document well, which admittedly his chicken scratch is way better than mine. I'll give him that. I mean, way better than my handwriting. That being said, it's still difficult for me to read. I'll do my best, though. Dear brethren in Christ, it is with great joy that I write to you following a practice begun by Pope Francis more than 10 years ago. I don't know what gosh, it's easier for me to read ancient Greek on ancient papyri than this. I mean, this is what? Huh? I don't know. Something the entire Episcopal College at important moments of papal magisterium. May De Lexi Te help the church to serve the poor and help bring the poor to Christ, fraternally in Christ, Pope Leo XIV. I'm a little glad he wasn't an ancient scribe, but not that some of the scribes were really good. Some were better than others, but yeah. But again, I mean, his handwriting admittedly is way better than mine, especially the cursive. I mean, that's impressive, you know. Not a lot of people do cursive anymore, right? But you know, the older generation, they learned cursive. You know, I was at that period of time where it was starting to kind of be phased out, and admittedly, I missed the cursive part of school because I had to move to Israel, and so I didn't ever really learn how to write in cursive, because that was taught at that time frame when I moved the second time to Israel as a kid. So yeah, I mean, I think I kind of figured out how to do cursive when I came back to the United States when I got older, just kind of looking at what people were doing. I think I kind of figured it out, but yeah, no, I don't do cursive because of that. So anyways, all right. So back to the point, there are a few articles that are coming up here. You know, there's a few things going on. So Pope Leo addresses policies in meeting with Chicago labor leaders, and look at him and Supich. Okay, there was that huge controversy with him and Supich very recently. Supich awarding pro-abortion with an award which he declined, but Pope Leo not only didn't condemn, but ended up making some very controversial statements in support of Supich, and who was seen as very, very liberal, and saying you can't be for the death penalty and still call yourself pro-life. So here he is. He's meeting with Supich. Everything's great, all smiles. And they're talking about immigration. Please know of my appreciation for your welcome of immigrants and refugees, especially your support of food pantries and shelters, while recognizing that appropriate policies are necessary to keep communities safe. I encourage you to continue to advocate for society to respect the human dignity of the most vulnerable. So he has a little bit of a caveat there, right? While recognizing that appropriate policies are necessary to keep communities safe. Okay, so he's saying, when he says in the exhortation here, rejecting an immigrant is rejecting Jesus. He has, at least here, elsewhere, outside of the document in this meeting, he has a little bit of a caveat to that, right? Recognizing appropriate policies are necessary to keep communities safe. Maybe he should address that a little bit more, though, right? Maybe to help balance some things out. He says, I encourage you to continue to advocate for society to respect the human dignity of the most vulnerable in society. In his meeting, he also praised the work of those who enhance the common good and help to create a society where all can flourish. Let me also show you something else here. Yeah, here it is. Pope Leo XIV commends Catholic Charities USA ministry to migrants and refugees. So Pope Leo sent a letter this week commending Catholic Charities USA for being agents of hope to vulnerable people, especially migrants and refugees. As migrants and refugees are not able to rely on their own resources and have to depend on God and the goodness of others, in many ways, your ministry makes the Lord's providence concrete for them, he says. Through providing food, shelter, medical care, legal assistance, and many other gestures of kindness, Catholic Charities affiliates across the United States show what Pope Francis often referred to as God's style of closeness, compassion, and tenderness. Catholic Charities was founded in 1910, a network of 168 independent Catholic charity agencies across all 50 United States. I'll put a link to the article in the show notes. You can go and read the rest of it if you would like. But again, he's very, very vocal here. And again, commenting on the question of immigration, both in the apostolic exhortation and in other interviews and comments and meetings now with the bishops taking place today. So very much involved in speaking about American politics. Some in the United States and even outside the United States are going to love it. Others in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. are going to absolutely hate it. These are very polarizing issues. People tend to be on opposite ends of the spectrum on these questions. There's very few people who hold to maybe a more balanced and nuanced position in these discussions. Some would even argue Leo doesn't hold to a balanced and nuanced position. Others say, no, he has a very balanced and nuanced position, right? So there's going to be kind of debate on, is he on the opposite end of the extreme of others on the other end of the extreme in the United States, or does he maybe take that more balanced approach? We're going to see a lot of debates on that, I think, in the coming days and weeks. And you're going to have a lot of commenters, Catholic content creators who are very involved in politics, who are probably going to weigh in on this. And it will be interesting to see what they say. I suspect some are going to come out and say, another commie pope, another woke Marxist pope. I suspect others are going to say, no, you're just panicans. And, this, he's offering a nuanced position here, or, hey, you don't necessarily have to agree with this. It's not ex cathedra. And there's going to be a lot of different ways that people process this. And if you want to know however, accurately to process magisterial documents, again, I've spoken about the magisterium at length here on this channel, and hopefully given you a little bit of direction on that conversation today about religious submission of intellect and will early at the beginning of the stream. But again, if you want to have a deeper dive in how to read magisterial documents, how to properly discern what parts are binding, what parts aren't, at what level, how authoritative, what religious submission is, what it isn't. Those are things that we have to cover in more in-depth content, which I've provided in my lectures on the magisterium. So once again, I want to remind you, go and take advantage of that discount for My magisterium courses explaining everything that you need to know about the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, what it is, what its foundation is, what its history is, and also how to read magisterial documents like the one in front of us, the Apostolic Exhortation. How do we make heads or tails of this? How authoritative is it? Is this part authoritative? Is this part not? And how do you read magisterial documents? I have a whole course on that. How to evaluate magisterial documents is how it's called. But you really need to work through maybe some of the other courses first, like Introduction to the Magisterium, to kind of benefit fully from that course. So I put all three courses. These are the courses that I teach at the university, at a Catholic university. These are the courses that I've put together as a bundle. It's already at a discounted price, but if you go ahead and sign up for my lecture on understanding papal infallibility that I'm going to deliver in 2 weeks, and if you cannot attend the lecture live, virtually online, that's fine. You'll always have access to the lecture. But if you purchase it right now at the early bird discount for $25, you'll get access, lifetime access to the lecture, understanding what papal infallibility is, what it isn't, some of the challenges and difficulties with it historically and presently. Um, if you purchase that after you've made the purchase, it'll then give you an additional 30% off the already discounted price on the Magisterial Studies program. So take advantage of that if you want to do a deep dive in furthering your education on understanding the Magisterium. You'll finally understand how it all works. I've laid out the most comprehensive program on the teaching authority of the church. There's nothing like it in the world. This is it. So definitely go and check it out. I think you'll really appreciate it and benefit from it. Again, that's rtcourses.com. R is in reason, T is in theology, courses.com. Now, hey, go and hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and let me hear your thoughts. What do you think about the new Apostolic Exhortation? Have you had a chance to read it yet? Are you going to read it? And what are your thoughts on it so far? I would love to hear from you. That's going to do it for today. I'll see you next time. God bless.